So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Laura Pinn. Dr. Pinn, I often see commenting on various things on social media, etc., and very knowledgeable. She is a assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And you'll note it on our website. She examines how social inequality, and this is, I can't think of more inequality in these situations, intersects with policy governance regimes and how political sciences can use community engaged research to understand participation in public policy. But definitely on the governance side, given now I'm a regional councillor, I'm keenly interested on the governance side of this whole issue as well and seeing what we can do at the municipal level. But Laura, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob, for the invitation to be here. And I just am tremendously flattered to be included on a panel with so many folks that I deeply matter doing work on this issue from so many perspectives. And right now I feel like I'm fired up because hearing these stories, it's really infuriating. And I think to take a bit of a, step back, a lot of it comes from the tension between the idea that having housing is a human right, but also we live in a society where property rights sort of reign like our king, right? And so you have people whose human right to housing is coming into conflict with what landlords understand as their property rights, right? Their ability to make use of something that they own as they see fit. And I'm really glad that Shannon raised vacancy decontrol, because I think a lot of the issues with renoviction go back to the changes that Mike Harris made in the 1990s. To create vacancy decontrol, where any rent that the market would bear could be charged on a vacant unit, and where rent control is really linked to an individual tenant rather than the unit, right? And so this creates a huge incentive in rent-controlled units to push tenants out. And there's just a couple points that I want to add to, I think, what's been really excellent and already said. One is that I think an issue, and I'm going to drop a link to a report in the chat that I think really gets at this. An issue for many of us that are focused on policy and policy solutions is that what the law says and what happens on the ground can be very disconnected. And so right now, the way that renovictions are functioning, it really relies on the tenant themselves to enforce their own rights. And that's a huge burden. Right? And landlords use so many extra legal tactics to pressure folks to leave. Tenants don't have access to full legal information all the time, maybe experiencing other forms of, intersecting marginalization. It can be very difficult. And so we need a system that doesn't rely on tenants to enforce their own rights. One of the things that I think is really important is I'm really glad I saw Meg posted about a landlord registry. And I think that's the piece there. If we wanted to reverse vacancy decontrol, we actually need much better information about rental units, where they are, what they're being rented at. And right now, the provincial government is not collecting that information. And actually, the City of Toronto Council, in their anti-renoviction bylaw, they actually requested the Ontario government start collecting more information because that sort of is a precursor to ending vacancy decontrol, which I think is an important step. I guess maybe I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to sort of note that if you are a tenant and your landlord is sending, and I am not a lawyer, but I will say this with certainty as if I were, if you are a tenant and your landlord issues you an N13 or another form with an N, do not move out. That is the number one sort of issue, in terms of losing housing security in your housing, is if you end up thinking that you have to vacate the unit. When really only the sheriff can evict you. And so if you don't see a sheriff coming, don't leave. And, I think like many people here, many people have very intimate experience of renoviction, and I certainly have had friends and neighbors renovicted, including ones that, thought they had to leave because of an N form. One at the landlord-tenant board, somebody new's in the unit, landlord-tenant board's not going to evict that new person. Right. And so they still ended up losing their housing. Right. And so I think that is just, my little 10 cents in there that I would throw. And I'm going to sort of stop now because I know Brian's still got to go. And then I think we want to have a Q&A.
Yeah, but hold on, Lauren. Lauren, not so fast. So first of all, that's great advice. Also, along with the bank will never call you for credit card information on the phone. But I just want to say, we had talked about rent banks in our discussion, and sometimes that comes up as a topic. And I'm just wondering if you could just touch briefly on this rent bank concept.
Sure. I don't know if anyone's heard about rent banks before. What I would call them is I would call them a useful housing stability tool that doesn't necessarily address some of the underlying dynamics. And I say that as an advocate for these programs. What they can do is they can provide financial assistance to folks at risk of losing their housing through a one-time first and last month payment. Sometimes it's repayable financial assistance. Sometimes it's an interest-free loan. But they're sort of there to try and prevent folks from losing their housing. But the other piece that I think is relevant to our conversation is they can serve as hubs to connect tenants experiencing eviction pressures to other supports. So in the case of Renovictions, they refer people to legal clinics where they can get better advice in terms of protecting their rights.
Is there examples of rent banks currently in place that you can share?
Yeah, so actually it'd be really interesting if Ontario looked at starting this province-wide. British Columbia and Manitoba, and now New Brunswick are having province-wide rent banks where the provincial government is rolling those out so there's full coverage across the province. In Ontario, the City of Toronto has a rent bank program that's been in operation for about a decade. And over the course of the pandemic, actually, due to additional funding, they were able to switch to a grants-based model rather than offering people loans. So non-repayable financial assistance can be really meaningful for folks who are facing eviction pressures, which come in many, many different forms, right? Sometimes renoviction style pressures come with also pressures around own use, landlords wanting to move in for own use, as well as rental arrears. These can all combine, right? And so having a rent bank program to help people when they have, they're dealing with these pressures can be really useful. Those are the ones that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I just noticed in the chat, Heather B posted Lutherwood. There's a eviction prevention and last month's rent fund there. So there's something locally there. But has there been any discussion about establishing rent banks here in Ontario or anything in that regard?
I mean, I don't think this government is interested in expanding social programming. I don't think so.
No, that's yeah. I think we'll all agree with that. But what about the other parties? For example, in their platforms, or have you heard anything that there's an interest amongst anyone else in bringing that forward?
Yeah, I've heard some conversations with the New Democrat Party and the Green Party, like in their platforms in particular, which obviously their political orientation is more friendly to expanding social policy and social programming. I mean, yeah, so again, I think they can be really useful in terms of a bit of a band-aid, people dealing with pressures directly on the ground. Again, I think real rent control in Ontario is what is going to halt the renoviction crisis. Right? And I think social pressure, political pressure, and organizing is so important around that.
Yeah, I guess sometimes, we talk about policy that has unintended consequences. And an example would be a freeze on tuition fees. And then next thing you know, colleges and universities have to look to other sources for income, which results in a lot of foreign students coming into the community and stuff like that. That's significantly higher rates. But whether this was intended or unintended, the 2018 changes certainly had some very serious consequences. And it's almost like a tsunami of very unfortunate things, along with the rise in rents, housing, homelessness, and everything else. It's just a terrible situation.
Yeah. And again, I mean, like, raise your hand if you know someone affected by that 2018 exclusion, with like where units that were occupied after 2018 as rentals can be raised, the rent can be raised by anything. Like, I'm sure most folks in this room, like I certainly
Yeah.
know somebody who was faced with a $600-700 rent increase and was like, all right, now I guess we're moving. So yeah, those sorts of gaps in terms of rent regulation and protection for tenants are really significant. And again, I think Brian's going to talk about this a bit more. I think municipalities are doing some important work. Once I stop talking, I'm going to put a link to Toronto's anti-renoviction bylaw, which I think is an interesting one to look at. But yeah, part of this is a provincial problem as well.
Yeah, certainly provincial issues. And if if we want to change any legislation, we've got to go provincially. But I guess there's some things we can maybe consider municipally. And I'm going to use that as a segue over to Brian now. So thank you very much, Laura.